So let's talk about different kinds of anger, and let's talk about the silent treatment versus the kind of yelling and aggression and the different kinds of somatic reactions we have. So there are two primary forms of rage that are expressed in, or the ways that rage are expressed in narcissistic relationship. There's passive aggression and overt aggression. And then these things can show up in many ways too. Hold it, put a pin in that. Before we get into these two types, I'm going to take a second and let you know about two in-person events I'm having this fall for survivors. One is in London, England, September 5th and 6th. The other is in North Carolina, November 1 to 3. And then there's also an event for coaches and therapists, and that's on September 7th in London. So go and check the video description, and you can get more details because these are live events, and I do not do these that often. So go check those out. Okay, so let's go back to anger. So much more interesting. So back to the two forms of rage. There's overt aggression, rage, or anger. That shows up as yelling, screaming, throwing things, perhaps even physical violence. It is unmistakable and it is unsettling. If you, for example, grew up with a narcissistic parent, the overt rage may be something that still affects you. And when you are in the presence of rage and anger as an adult, that encoded and held response in your body can mean that being around angry people, especially ones who yell, doesn't work. Doesn't work for you. The overt aggression can show up in intimate relationships in a wide variety of ways. And over time, just the anticipation of the rage and anger are enough to keep a partner in line, with people walking on eggshells and holding back on doing or saying anything. And overt aggression, or the threat of it, is often a dynamic that's observed in relationships with malignant narcissistic folks. And it's sort of a clear dynamic. It's sort of the central kind of dynamic in coercively controlling relationships. Narcissistic bosses may be overly rageful, yelling and screaming at people in the workplace. And we've all heard the apocryphal stories or survived them of the raging, humiliating boss, or the boss that throws the laptop or the phone or the this and breaks the door and all of that. Narcissistic people are often too clever and too concerned with what people think of them to express or show their rage overtly. And instead, we will see that their rage and anger will often show up when we are alone with them. That can mean that you are living in two realities: the abusive one that few see, and the more charming or at least restrained ones that others see. Overt narcissistic rage and anger are set off in the way that all narcissistic rage is set off, through what we call an ego injury. And that ego injury could be because they were frustrated, because they were disappointed, because someone didn't read their mind, because someone was getting something better than them. So for example, someone else got the promotion they wanted or bought the car that they wanted to get. Even a passing critique can be enough to create an ego injury. So that means that living with a narcissistic person who expresses their rage overtly is like living with things that could blow up at any time, and you never know how badly the explosion's going to be or when it'll go off. And this can result in lifelong hypervigilance, being on edge, and what we call hyperarousal and chronic anxiety that can stay with you for a lifetime. Then there is passive aggression. While the overt aggression and rage are something we are more likely to see in malignant narcissistic folks, and perhaps in some grandiose folks, the passive aggression is the mothership of the vulnerable narcissistic folks. The passive aggression is typically expressed as withdrawing, withholding, one-word answers, talking through other people, things like you're sitting right there, but then they'll say, "Tell your mother that I need the car keys," that kind of thing. There may also be full-on silent treatment, as well as other passive-aggressive barbs thrown in. This could be things like them doing something so sloppily that you're like, you either end up doing it yourself and don't ask them to do it again because it was such a mess. They'll pretend that they didn't get a message and then not doing something that you were counting on them to do, thus leaving you in the lurch. Other little digs would be things like, Oh, I saw that you got the groceries and you actually remember the coffee this time that I like. Well, there's a surprise. Or they'll procrastinate on things that matter to you. And by procrastinating, that creates a mess and a world of headaches for you. Or they'll complain about a third party, but actually it reflects something you're doing. Like, oh gosh, I can't believe she does that. And yet it's something you do. It's exhausting. It's not scary, but it's exhausting. Passive aggression can be a part of the larger victim complex that characterizes so much of vulnerable narcissism. Anger is a universal experience in these relationships, but these two forms of anger can have very different effects on us. Let's start with the overt aggression. This is the stuff that can wreck your nervous system. The range of effects can be the stuff we see in PTSD, such as hypervigilance, avoidance. You may find yourself living in a chronic state of tension, not sleeping well, even having nightmares. You may feel a sense of dread at going home, dread of having to tell them something or ask them something. You may find yourself flinching or having hyperarousal symptoms like an accelerated heart rate or shortness of breath when you are around a rager, even if it's not the original narcissistic rager. Now, the passive aggression does something different to us. Not maybe, in some cases yes, but we may not see as much of the intense arousal and physiological reactions. However, as I said, for folks for whom abandonment, for example, is a core wound, the passive aggression and the withdrawing and withholding and silence can bring up those old feelings that can be felt as panic and wanting to fix it and make it normal. This can be compounded if there are children or other people around, and it is why people get so stuck in relationships with vulnerable narcissistic folks, because you are often just giving in to make the silent and withholding patterns stop. The other reaction here, especially if the abandonment is not so triggering, is that of exhaustion and depletion. Again, we get back to that dread, but now the dread isn't the fear of unpredictable anger, but rather the dread of the heaviness, the little digs, the proverbial death by 1,000 cuts that often goes alongside the passive aggression. It is exhausting to have to navigate the landmines of having to do things twice because the passive aggressor did them so poorly in the first place and then plays victim if you point it out. In fact, plays victim if you point anything out. So there is no hope of communication or growth. It's just a horrible spiral of them behaving petulantly, sullenly, and like a spoiled child, and you feeling silenced because you just can't listen to the whole victimized rant again. And then over time, you have to be the only grown-up in the relationship. Passive aggression is particularly atrocious for children who don't understand why a parent withdraws or gives them the silent treatment. And it can be quite scary with children blaming themselves and in essence being sort of taught, being prepared to behave exactly the way the parent wants because the child is trying to avoid the parent abandoning them and their inducing of guilt. The parent saying things like, well, everyone else has such easy children. Why are you so difficult? One of these, with the passive aggressive versus the overt aggressive, I don't believe that one is easier than the other. And frankly, most narcissistic relationships have both forms of anger housed in them. These two forms of anger may affect us all a little differently depending on our histories, with the folks who are enduring the chronic bouts of overt rage feeling more rattled and then ultimately desensitized by the emotional violence of the relationship, while the folks in the passive-aggressive relationships may feel more depleted and wrung out and maybe even depressed, because ultimately you may not You may be avoiding the menace of brutal anger in your face, but the ongoing whining and victimhood is what you're experiencing, and it makes it too difficult to ask them to do anything. However, most narcissistic relationships favor one type of anger over the other. And if you have more than one of these relationships, you may find that you are having different experiences in these relationships. And the different ways of expressing rage may be part of why this is happening. Whatever it is, passive-aggressive rage, overt rage, any rage, it is not good for your health. Thanks again.